Hi there, welcome to the archives. So this episode is called, this is looking at interventions from Black feminists within the continent of Africa and North America, specifically the US. So white feminism has typically constructed Black sub-Saharan African women as passive recipients of aid, unable to solve our own problems, many of which were brought on by colonialism, imperialism, and white Europeans. People really get sick of these terms. They really just don't like it. Like what do they call it? The wokeism? They don't like it. But these are the names. This is the name, the language that's given to the process. This is what happened. It was called. Anyways, so African feminists like Amata Edu, Akosian Pofo, Adumako, Owino Okesh, they've all claimed space within Black feminism and have worked to disrupt feminist campaigns to save African women from African men. And this was, I'm being sarcastic, this is a quote, right? This idea that we need to be saved from our own. Which, based on the last episode, that's not entirely untrue in terms of like Black femicide, for instance. But it's this idea that's shrouded in colonial or even like a neo-colonial rhetoric that suggests that patriarchy and misogyny are inherent or even synonymous with Black people, Black men, or Africa. That's not necessarily the case. So even with Black femicide, yes, it's Black men in the state that primarily are killing us in North America. This is an issue globally. Femicide is something that is being faced by women all over the world, right? It's not something, Black femicide is not something that's inherent to just Black people or African men or Black men. And another thing, in the last blog, I was often saying femicide when it should have been Black femicide is what I was speaking to specifically. Because femicide was just in general, right, which is just murdering women and girls. But then in that context, and also I was saying Dr. Farrakhan, it's Dr. Ade Farrakhan. When I'm reading or talking, sometimes it doesn't always translate in words. So I just wanted to note that it's Dr. Ade Farrakhan, and her work looking specifically at Black femicide, not just femicide, in its entirety, although that across the world that is an issue globally. So Amata Edu was saying that the docile, mendicant African woman of today is actually a media creation, right? If you're thinking this idea that African women are docile, that's not necessarily true. It's something that the media created, is what Ata Edu said. So as Indigenous women, these distortions are far from true, though this is not to say that patriarchy, sexism, misogyny, that these misogynoir, that these are not issues that African women contend with, right? So Edu identified 3 historical factors that have shaped this idea that we have in that the contemporary African woman is weak, submissive, or not a feminist, right? Or not feminist enough, or anti-feminist, right? So this includes, number 1, Indigenous African societal patterns. So for example, traditional gender roles that are rooted in like heteronormativity, that say that women have to like marry men and reproduce babies. This is Edu's work. So that was the first one. The second one is the conquest of Africa by Europe. So some call it the scramble for Africa, colonization, imperialism. It's just talking, that's the language that would be given to the conquest of Africa by Europe. And then the third one, is the lack of vision, courage, and leadership from African leaders in the post-colonial period. So for example, corruption, within African government officials that are seduced by white European ways of being and dominating. So those are the three different contexts in which Ama Ata Edu was talking about how we now arrive to this idea that African women are weak, or that we're submissive, or that we are recipients of like aid and everything and being imported from the West is not necessarily true. These three things have played a role in why we think that. So speaking on the submissive African woman, Edu wrote, and this is a direct quote, if she does exist, she is a result of traumas of the last 500 years encountered with the West, the last 100 years of colonial repression, and the current neo-colonial disillusionment. You can find that on page 42. So these three factors, they work together to shape the idea that African women are not only submissive, but that we're against the idea of feminism, seeing it as a Western byproduct and an African. To be clear, African women who do deny, there are African women who deny and reject feminism, right? They exist. And like I talked about in the previous blog, there are reasons for this. It's not necessarily the practice or what it is, gender equality that's being denied. It's a term feminism that's being denied, right? Because of the way it's located within the West, because of the way that has come to signify like anti-men, anti-family, raw burning feminists, like I spoke about in the previous blog. And so they do exist. They are out there. I'm not saying that they're not. But in many cases, it's not that that these African women are against the idea of feminism per se, or what the values of it is, that they're not opposed to gender equality, right? They're opposed and reject the idea of Western or white feminism. That is what they take issue with. That is what they're not. What they're saying we don't really mess with necessarily. And so like Asian feminists discussed in the previous blog, they instead reject the idea of white feminism or Western feminism or mainstream feminism, however you define it. And some people really get in their feelings about this because they're just like, we shouldn't have divisions within feminism. Feminism is just feminism. And like I've said in previous blogs, others are saying, no, it's actually plural. So, and why is it plural? Because there's different articulations of it, right? Some feminisms emerge out of nationalism and independence, and not necessarily from just a fight against like patriarchy, as you might think or you might consider it to be. So in The African Woman Today, Ama Ata Edu gave examples of African women who fought for liberation. I've read this. These are all sections from the dissertation. I've read this before. I'll read it again because it's important to note. And so she raises liberation from various European colonizers well before North American first wave feminism, right? So in the last blog, we're looking at the 1880s. Feminism comes out of France. Well, some of these examples that she raises were from like the 1600s. And I'll explain why it's not necessarily feminism per se, but I'm speaking more to the fight for nationalism, for independence, and how that was tied to a lot of women's work, or women were at the forefront of those efforts, right? People will say, well, that's not feminist. Just because a soldier went to war for their country, that has nothing to do with gender equality. And some African feminists will actually say no, that in fighting for the nation, in fighting for our independence, that is also a fight for women. It's just that it's not patriarchy per se, but it's a specific type of patriarchy that we're fighting, right? They were fighting British men, for instance, going to war with the British armies. And so I'll get into that. But so some of the examples, she brings us to Benin, circa 1600. So this is the example that we see in Woman King, right? It was rooted in Benin, 1600s, where an all-female battalion of Dahomey women protected their empire from being invaded. During the 17th century, Queen Nzinga also fought to prevent the Portuguese from overturning Angola. In Ghana, known as the Ashanti Empire then, Asojefo Santwa also did the same, led an uprising against the British during the war for the Golden Stool. And these examples, again, in Nigeria, Igbo women in the East harassed the British colonial administration in 1920 to the point where they had to move their headquarters from Calabar to Lagos. In Zimbabwe, Mbuya Nehanda was hanged for an insurgency against the British. In Kenya, General Mathoni was a guerrilla leader who, during the Mama Rebellion against the British. This connects to the point of Asian feminism, where their brand, the brand of feminism in some Asian countries, like I noted, Cambodia, the Philippines, Indonesia, those rose out of fights for nationalism, for independence. This is the same way. And I've seen people say that, again, that's not feminism. You're right, that's not feminism. That's exactly what we're saying. But that doesn't mean that it's not a fight for gender equality. It just looks different because we were fighting women. It wasn't just our men that we were fighting for. We were also fighting women. And our way of looking at it is collective and societal. So we're not only fighting for women alone, we're fighting for the nation, we're fighting for men as well, we're fighting for children, we're fighting for families. And so that was the difference between Western feminism and Asian feminism, or even African feminism, right? In an African context, it's not women against men at all. We're also fighting to preserve the African family, and that includes men and children. The earlier narratives cannot be said to be examples of feminism proper based on Western definitions of feminism, because it was not Black patriarchs that these women opposed. We cannot separate patriarchal oppression from colonial oppression, right? An intersectional analysis is needed here. While it was not the African man that these women warriors were fighting against at the time, it was colonial patriarchy all the same. The battles they took on were against white colonial men, and in the name of equality, in the name of freedom, in the name of independence. They fought not only on behalf of women, but also children and men. Rarely does African feminism leave men and children behind. This is something that Adonako talks about. Our feminism doesn't leave men or children behind. There isn't all of this tension between men and women. Maybe in a more contemporary context, we're finding that. But historically and traditionally, feminism within the African context is very familial. It's very community-based. And like I said, it was rooted in nationalism. So these are prime examples of women's liberation, even when African women fought for more than just women alone, right? And if you watch Women King, you see that there is a really strong archetype that comes to the forefront, where these women have a sense of power, even though, like I said in the previous video, there was still, sexism. You could still see it in there. There was still like slavery, for instance. It was a really convoluted and complicated or complex dynamics. But what white feminists are just some people in general have done is to claim the word feminism, which is fine, you can have it. It did come out of France, right? And define it as something that Black, Indigenous, and other feminists of color have taken issue with. This has led to non-white feminists distancing themselves. When I say non-white here, I'm speaking of like African people, specifically African women, distancing themselves from the term feminism, even if they also provide templates of what we currently envision as feminism. So while some African women have always been doing and advocating for women's work and gender equality, white feminism has hijacked and claimed ownership over these types of work and erased different articulations, only to then turn around and claim that these histories are not feminist enough because patriarchy, as white women knew it, was not centered in these histories. Right? So while Africa is the origin of so much of what has come to be collected and appropriated, African women and Africa in general have been etched into the collective consciousness as obsolete, right? Poverty-stricken, just to be erased, left out, or the stories told in a way that's not completely true to how it really actually is. Or as mimicry, right? So Chandra Mohanty talks about how the West comes to stand in as the original, and then the rest of us are seen as mimicking it. And that's not necessarily the truth. So despite these challenges, African feminists have raised and continue to do so. They resisted and continue to do so. They have existed and they still exist. And they engage in revolutionary work in a more contemporary framework. It is more looking at domestic violence. I can't claim to be an expert on African feminism proper, right? I didn't even really learn about African feminism until like my PhD, which is really sad, and I write about that. Because again, so much of feminism within that I was learning in the academy at least was very much centered on North America, on, Canadian suffrage movements, white women, and so on and so forth. So I'm not very connected with the African community, African or the Ghanaian feminists, but I see folks doing a lot of incredible work, specifically right now, around the LGBTQ ban in Ghana, for instance, domestic violence. People have been at the forefront of like corrective rape, advocating for that. So women in politics, so the way in which African feminism takes shape today is also very different than in the past, and it's more aligned in how we would define feminism today. So in the Americas, Black women born during the era of slavery, the enslavement of Black Africans, leaders like Sojourner Truth, they were actively engaged in feminist organizing as early as 1851. So in third wave Black feminism, Kimberly Springer brings our attention to Black feminist figures who were already resisting sexism, slavery, anti-Black racism, and as far back as the antebellum period, right? So notably, Springer highlights contributions from Angela Davis, Deborah Gray White, and Harriet Jacobs, whose research on narratives of enslaved people sheds light on how enslaved women fought back against rape, for instance, forced pregnancy, and separation from their children and families. So that's what it would look like in that context. These forms of feminist rebellion predate first wave feminism. As with much of the mainstream feminism, the erasure of Black women and Blackness in general meant that these accounts were minimized, if not erased entirely. So for this reason, Black women have had to carve out our own space within the feminist movement. So folks like Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, They've all advocated for Black feminisms. Alice Walker created a new vocabulary like womanism or womanists to replace feminists. And this Black feminism basically is a direct response to second wave feminism, mainstream or white feminism, and its anti-Black exclusionary practices. It emerged in the late 1960s thanks to second wave Black feminists, activists who took issue with white feminism's inability to address Black women, who stepped into the movement as both gendered, so as women, but then also racialized as Black women. And so Black feminist theory gained popularity by the 1970s and was well positioned as a theoretical framework due in large part to the Combahee River Collective. So the Combahee River Collective is best known for the role in the creation of Black feminist theorizing and Black feminism. The collective originated in the US. So according to, specifically the National Black Feminist Organization, the NBFO. So according to Becky Thompson, the collective was named after a river in South Carolina, where it is said that Harriet Tubman led a resistance movement that resulted in 750 enslaved people becoming free. The manifesto was drafted by the collective, and it was put together by folks like Barbara Smith, her sister Beverly Smith, and Danita Frazier. The collective was formed out of resistance to challenge white supremacy within mainstream feminism. They took issue with white feminism's inability to hold space for issues of anti-Black racism, diverse sexual orientations, gender variance, disability, and class. And they said that it's inseparable from one's gender. Feminist activists, organizers, different scholars to professionals, feminists, they argued that while they were able to organize on behalf of the vast majority of women, not just Black women, sometimes white feminists struggle to mobilize also on behalf of Black and other women of color. And so it's out of this genealogy that Black feminist theory was born. So, yeah, Black queer, don't forget, trans women also were very much at the forefront. Stonewall, I'm always reminded, was led by Black trans women of color, Marsha P. Johnson, and all of these people worked towards a truly universal vision of freedom and liberation for more women, including those that were poor or low income, or even located outside of the United States. Angela Davis's work talks about beyond just the US, right? But in most cases, it was white feminists that were given the credit of being universal. And then Black women, Black feminists were told that they were being divisive and polarizing. So in having these conversations, this is often the critique, the charge that Black feminists get, is you're being divisive, right? Why are you only focusing on Black people? What about the rest of us? This is polarizing. This is creating divisions. This is, you're angry. What are some of the different things that you hear? There's an agenda. Now we're using words like grifting and race baiting, right? So it's this idea that there isn't a need for Black feminism, there isn't a need for creating an offshoot of feminism, because feminism was already created to include all women. But as the last few posts have shown, it hasn't necessarily included all women. It's very much been certain type of women. And so that's not seen as divisive. right? When white feminism is left out, African feminists, for instance, that's not seen as exclusionary. That's just where we are. We've been to Africa. We saved you guys from female circumcision. We saved you from your men. We did include you, right? And even the way that it's framed is also very condescending, like this very savior approach. But to say that, then you become the problem. You become the problem, right? The issue becomes that Black women are creating this space that's unnecessary. We then are the troublemakers. We're creating divisions where there shouldn't be any, and it becomes this huge thing. So, Indigenous poet Christos explained, I left the women's movement completely, utterly drained. I have no interest in returning. Perhaps white women are so rarely loyal because they do not have to be. And that's a quote. So these are some of the tensions, these are some of the conflicts and the negative experiences within the feminist movements that are felt and have impact. Again, people will use this to say, well, then just get rid of all of it. We can all have our own opinions about different things, right? But this is what I wanted to share about interventions from Black African feminists. Sorry, babe. I'm low energy right now. It's been a long day. So please stay tuned. Thank you. Until next time, in solidarity.